You did not see it coming. One moment, everything was ordinary. A normal evening. A quiet morning. A conversation that had barely even started. And then something shifted. Not gradually. Not with any warning you could name. One moment they were fine, and the next, the atmosphere in the room had changed entirely. The temperature dropped. The air thickened. And you were standing in the middle of it, trying to understand what had just happened, and what you had done to cause it. Because that is where your mind went immediately. To what you did, not to what they did. Not to the disproportionate nature of what you just witnessed. To what you might have said, what you might have forgotten, what you might have got wrong that justified that. If that is a pattern you recognize, this video is for you. Because what you experienced has a name. It is called narcissistic rage. And once you understand what it actually is, what it is doing, where it comes from, and why it follows the specific pattern it does, you will never be confused by it again. Most people, when they hear the word rage, imagine something obvious. An explosion. Shouting. A person visibly out of control. And sometimes that is what narcissistic rage looks like. But in the covert version, the version that operates in close relationships, in homes, in quiet private spaces, it frequently does not look like that at all. Covert narcissistic rage is often cold. It is controlled. It is the jaw that tightens rather than the voice that rises. It is the door that closes with slightly too much force. It is the silence that fills a room like a physical presence. It is the withdrawal of warmth so total and so sudden that you feel it in your body before you have even understood what happened. This matters because cold rage is harder to identify than hot rage. Hot rage is visible. You can point to it. You can name it. Cold rage operates underneath language, underneath what can be directly challenged, and it places the burden of interpretation entirely on you. You are left asking yourself, am I imagining this? Is something wrong? Did I do something? That uncertainty is not accidental. It is one of the ways covert narcissistic rage maintains its power. Here is the part that most people who have lived with narcissistic rage find most destabilizing. The trigger, or rather, the apparent absence of one. You learn over time to watch for it. You develop a kind of low-level surveillance of the atmosphere around you. You become attuned to the signals, the slight change in posture, the particular quality of quiet, the way the energy in the room shifts, because you have learned that something is coming, and you want to be ready. But what you cannot learn is what will set it off. Because it is not consistent. It is not logical. It does not follow the rules of normal human cause and effect. A cup left in the wrong place. A comment that sounded entirely neutral. Arriving home 5 minutes later than expected. Asking a simple question at the wrong moment. Being happy when they are not. These are not provocations. They are ordinary moments. And yet they produce a reaction so disproportionate, so consuming, that you are left genuinely unable to account for what just happened. This is by design, not necessarily consciously but functionally. The unpredictability is part of the mechanism. When you cannot identify the trigger, you cannot avoid it. And when you cannot avoid it, you cannot relax. You remain in a constant state of low-level vigilance, which is exactly where covert narcissistic control operates most effectively. Now let us go beneath the surface of the rage, because what looks like an explosion over nothing is never actually about nothing. Narcissistic rage has a source, and that source is a wound to what psychologists call the narcissistic ego, a deep, structural injury to the sense of self that the narcissist has spent their entire life constructing and protecting. The covert narcissist's internal world is built on a foundation that is far more fragile than it appears. Beneath the surface, beneath the performed suffering, the quiet superiority, the carefully maintained image, there is a self that is acutely sensitive to perceived criticism, perceived rejection, and perceived disrespect. The key word there is perceived, because the wound does not require an actual slight. It does not require genuine disrespect or real criticism. It requires only the perception of one. A moment that, through the lens of the narcissist's injured ego, registers as a threat to their status, their image, or their sense of control. That cup in the wrong place? It registered as disregard. That innocent comment? It landed as criticism. Your happiness, on a day when they were struggling? It registered as a statement about their inadequacy. You were not doing any of those things. But the wounded ego translated your ordinary behavior into a threat, and the rage was the response to that threat. This is not an excuse for the behavior. It is an explanation of the mechanism. And the mechanism matters, because once you understand it, You stop trying to identify what you did wrong, and you start seeing what was always already broken. Here is something that may be difficult to hear, but it is important. Narcissistic rage is not just a loss of control. In the covert version especially, it is a form of control. Think about what happens in the household after a rage episode. Think about how the atmosphere changes. Think about what you start doing differently. You become quieter. You become more careful. You choose your words with more precision. You stop mentioning certain things. You start anticipating moods, scanning rooms before you enter them, adjusting your behavior preemptively to avoid the next eruption. You, in other words, have been trained, not through explicit instruction, not through rules you were given, through the experience of the consequence, through the repeated, unpredictable application of emotional punishment, until your behavior began to reshape itself around the avoidance of that punishment. This is how rage functions as a control mechanism. It does not need to happen every day. It does not need to be severe every time. It needs only to be unpredictable enough and uncomfortable enough that the people around it begin to self-regulate on the narcissist's behalf. You stopped being yourself. You started being careful. And careful people do not challenge. Careful people do not set limits. Careful people make themselves smaller and smaller and smaller until the space they occupy no longer threatens the person they are trying not to provoke. That is not love. That is management of a threat. And you have been doing it for so long that it may have started to feel like the same thing. If you have been in this dynamic for any length of time, you will recognize a pattern. Not just the rage itself, but what surrounds it. The tension that builds before, the explosion or withdrawal that follows, and then the reset. The reset is the part that keeps people confused the longest. Because after the episode, after the cold fury or the eruption or the punishing silence, there is often a return. Not always an apology, not always an acknowledgement of what happened, but a normalization, a resumption of ordinary behavior as though the episode did not occur. A warmth, sometimes, that feels like relief. And you receive that warmth. Because you have been in the cold for so long, that warmth feels like resolution. But it is not resolution. It is the cycle resetting. The tension will rebuild. The trigger will arrive, unpredictable, inexplicable. The rage will discharge again, and the reset will follow. Psychologists sometimes describe this as intermittent reinforcement, the alternation between punishment and reward that creates some of the strongest and most difficult to break emotional bonds in human experience. The relief of the reset feels disproportionately good because the suffering before it was real, and that relief keeps you in the cycle. Understanding the cycle does not end it, but it does change your relationship to it. You stop waiting for the reset as a sign that things have changed. You start seeing it as a stage in a pattern that will repeat until something structurally changes. Let us name something directly. If you have been living in proximity to narcissistic rage, the likelihood is that you have spent a significant amount of your energy trying to find out what you are doing wrong. You have reviewed conversations. You have replayed moments. You have adjusted your behavior, your tone, your timing, the way you phrase things, the topics you raise, the ones you avoid. You have become extraordinarily skilled at reading a room, and still found yourself in the middle of an episode you did not see coming. This is not because you are bad at relationships. This is because you were given a puzzle with no solution, and told the confusion was your failure. Covert narcissistic rage is functionally designed to be unattributable. The triggers are inconsistent precisely, so they cannot be learned. The cold delivery makes it harder to name as abuse. The reset erases the evidence before the pattern can be seen clearly. And the pervasive message, delivered not in words but in atmosphere, is, if you were different, this would not happen. You internalize that message. Most people do, because it is more tolerable, in the short term, to believe that the problem is something you can fix, than to accept that it is something you cannot. But you cannot fix it, not because you are insufficient, because the source of the rage is not your behavior. It is a wound that existed long before you arrived, a structural fragility in the narcissist's sense of self that no amount of careful behavior on your part can repair. There is a specific shift that happens when a person begins to understand narcissistic rage for what it is. It does not feel like triumph. It rarely even feels like relief, not at first. What it feels like most often is grief, because clarity means something has to be let go. The story you were telling yourself, that things will stabilize, that the right adjustment will make the difference, that the warmth of the reset reflects something durable and real, That story becomes very difficult to maintain once you have seen the mechanism behind it. And with that grief comes something else. Something quieter and more solid. A different kind of attention. Instead of spending your energy on the question of what you did wrong, you begin to spend it on what is actually happening. Instead of scanning for triggers you cannot identify, you begin to recognize the cycle for what it is. Instead of receiving the reset as evidence of change, you begin to sit with the knowledge that the reset is a stage, and that the stage will pass. None of this is a magic resolution, but it is the beginning of something that matters enormously. It is the beginning of you no longer being confused. And for the person who has spent years inside this dynamic, the end of confusion is not a small thing. It is the ground everything else is built on.